Hey, my name is Wendell Carroll. I'm 58 years old, and I live alone at the end of Ash Ferry Road, 6 miles east of Blue Rock, Missouri, and last autumn a note I had no honest way to pay was set to take the ferry landing my father, and I built with our own hands out from under me. It isn't grand. A plank house on a bluff over the Gasconade River, a small cornfield behind it, a smokehouse, a chicken run, and the ferry itself, a flat wooden barge on a cable that I've poled and cranked across that river in every kind of water for near 40 years, hauling wagons and stock and Sunday travelers from the Blue Rock side to the mill road on the far bank. There's a deep porch across the front of my house, and on the corner post hangs a railroad lantern with a red glass I bought off a brakeman in Jefferson City the year I married my Ada, and I've lit it every night since she passed. Habit, I called it. If you'd told me last September that a photograph made in a stranger's wagon was about to save this landing, and that the biggest man in 3 counties was already loading a lie onto the ferry to ride it up to my door, I'd have said grief had finally turned my head. But that is exactly the way it happened. Every word of this is how it happened. People in Blue Rock are decent to my face and quiet behind me. They call me the ferryman, and some of the younger ones call me the man who wouldn't sell, because for 2 years now a company man has been coming around offering money for my crossing, wanting to run a toll bridge where my cable hangs, and I have kept saying no. Ada died 3 summers back of a fever that came on a Thursday and took her by the next, and after they buried her I found I had no words left to spend on anybody. We never had children who lived past their first year. There were 2, laid in the churchyard under one small stone, and after that the Lord closed that door, and Ada and I made our peace with a still house and each other and the river going by. When she went, the stillness got into the walls, and it did not come out. I ran the ferry, I fed the hens, I put up corn nobody but me would eat, I lit her red lantern, and I slept in a bed that had gone too wide, in a house so quiet I could hear the cable creak in the wind all the way up from the water. The trouble with the money came the way trouble always comes to a riverman, all at once and from upstream. A spring flood tore my landing to splinters and snapped the north cable anchor clean out of the bank. And a ferry with no landing is just a raft nobody can board, so I borrowed against the crossing to rebuild the whole works. Timber and cable and a new capstan, $1,200 from the bank in Blue Rock, due in full at the end of October. I had my ferry tolls and my corn and a little put by, and no figuring I could do at the kitchen table by lamplight that ever reached $1,200 before the leaves came down. Some nights I sat with Ada's account book and my spectacles and just stared at the number until it stopped meaning anything at all. The wagon came up the mill road on a cold, clear evening in the middle of September, the last light going gold on the water, and I heard it before I saw it. 1 horse and a load creaking on a bad axle. I had shut the ferry for the day and was splitting kindling by the porch when it came around the willows on the far bank. A tall, square-built wagon with a canvas top and words painted down the side in a fine hand, though I couldn't read them at that distance in that light. A woman sat the seat alone. She stopped at the water's edge and looked across at me, and at the barge tied up on my side, and even from there, I could see the horse was done in, and the wagon was riding low and wrong. "Ferries close till morning," I called across, and the sound went out flat over the river, the way sound does at dusk on water. "I've no fare for it anyway," she called back, and her voice hardly shook, though I'd learn later that everything else about her situation was shaking. "I only need to know if there's a town near, and a place a person can stop the night that won't cost what I don't have." "There's Blue Rock," I said, 3 miles up my road on this bank, But there's no crossing you tonight. The current's up, and I don't run her in the dark for anybody." She sat a moment with that, her hands quiet on the reins. And then she said, "Then I'll make my camp here on this side and trouble you at first light. And thank you kindly." And I could hear in it that she was too proud to ask for the one thing she plainly needed, which was to not be alone on a strange bank in the cold with a broken wagon. I stood my axe in the block. "The mill road's no place to camp," I called. "There's men use it after dark I wouldn't want a woman alone near. I'm coming across for you. Poling that barge over empty water in the last of the light against a current still full of spring is work." And my shoulders were near 60 years old and told me so the whole way. When I brought her aboard, wagon and tired horse and all, and she stood beside me on the deck holding her horse's cheek strap and steadying him against the sway, I got my first close look at her. Young, 30, maybe a year past. A gray traveling dress worn thin and mended careful at the elbows. A man's canvas coat over it far too big for her, hands stained dark at the fingers, with something that wasn't dirt and wouldn't wash, and a way of looking at everything, the river and the barge and the cable and my face, like she was fixing it in her mind to keep. On the side of her wagon, close up now, I could read the paint at last. It said, in gold gone dull, "Prosper Vane, Portraits and Views," and under that, smaller, a name that had been painted out. Somebody had brushed over a name and left the rest. I said nothing about it. When we touched my landing, she led the horse off herself before I could offer, and she looked up my bluff at the house and the porch and the red lantern I'd not yet lit, and she said, "I can pay you for the crossing in work, or in a portrait if you've any use for one, but I won't take it as charity. I don't take charity." "Nobody's charity is on offer," I said. "I don't run a poorhouse. I run a ferry, and the ferry says a body doesn't camp on the mill road after dark. Come up, there's a shed you can back the wagon into, out of the weather. And there's supper if beans and cornbread suit you." She backed that wagon into my machine shed as neat as I could have done it myself, and she rubbed her horse down and fed him from a nosebag out of her own thin stores before she'd come to the house, and that told me most of what I needed to know about her. That she'd feed the animal that carried her before she fed herself. Inside, I built up the stove and set the beans back over the heat and cut the cornbread, and I got a look at her hands in the lamplight while she ate, slow and careful the way hungry people eat when they don't want to be seen being hungry. The stain on her fingers was in the creases and under the nails, brown and silver black, and I'd seen a stain like it exactly once, years back, on a man who'd come through making tintypes at the Blue Rock Fair. "What do they call you?" I asked her. "Nora," she said, just the one name, set down careful, like a coin she couldn't spare the rest of, and then, after a moment, watching me, "Nora Vane." "That your wagon out there," I said, "Prosper Vane, Portraits and Views." "It was my husband's," she said, and something went across her face and was gone. "He's dead. 14 months. "I'm sorry for it," I said. "So am I," she said, and left it there, and I let her, because a man who has buried his own knows you don't go digging in another's grave for conversation. "Wendell Carroll," I told her. "There's a room off the back was going to be a child's once, the bed's aired and it's clean, and the door bolts from the inside if that eases you any. I'll be gone at first light," she said. "The river has its own opinion on first light this time of year," I said. "You'll cross when it's safe and not before." Before I went up that night, I did the thing I do every night I'm granted. I carried the lantern out to the corner post and lit the wick behind the red glass, and the light of it lay down on the porch boards like a little pool of blood-warm gold. When I came back in, she was standing in the hall with her arms crossed, watching me through the window. "Are you signaling somebody?" she asked. "No," I said. My wife lit that lamp every night we lived here. She used to say it wasn't for us in the warm house who already knew our way. It was for whoever was still out in the dark trying to find theirs. I've kept it lit since she died. Nora looked at the red light a long moment through the glass, and then she looked at me, and then she said good night quiet and went into the back room, and I heard the bolt slide home soft and almost apologetic, and I made my boots heavy on the stairs so she'd know exactly how far off across the house I slept. In the morning the river was still running high and brown, and I told her so, and she took it better than I feared. She'd meant to be pushing on to the rail town at Dixon, she said, to set up her camera at the depot and make portraits of folks coming and going, that being how she'd fed herself and the horse for 14 months, town to town, a week here and a week there, wherever people had a coin and a face they wanted kept. But the current wasn't safe for her overloaded wagon, and she'd no money to wait out an inn, and so when I said she could work her keep until the water dropped, mucking the ferry deck and helping me haul the wagons and feeding the hens, she took it, but only after she'd looked at me hard to be sure I meant work and not pity. That was how it started. No plan in it at all. The water stayed up 3 days on the first rain, and then a second rain came behind it and kept the river brown a week more, and by then she'd made herself so useful I'd have been the poorer for her leaving. She was strong for her size, and she learned the ferry fast, the cable and the capstan and the way you read the current before you push off, and she could gentle my ferry horse, the one I used to help crank the barge in high water, better than I could talking to him low the whole time. But it was the wagon that undid me. On the 4th evening, the chores done and the rain drumming the roof, she asked, careful, whether I'd sit for a portrait, since she'd nothing else to pay with and it plainly bothered her to owe. I said I had no use for a picture of my own sour face and no wall to hang it on, and she went quiet, and I saw I'd stepped on something, so I said, but Ada, my wife, we never once had a likeness made of her. Not in 29 years, and I've near forgotten the exact set of her eyes, and it's the one thing I'd have if I could have anything. Nora was quiet a moment. I can't make you a picture of the dead, she said gently, but I can show you what I do, if you'd like to understand it. And she took a lamp and led me out to the shed, and she opened the back of that wagon, and inside it was a whole little world I'd never dreamed of. There was a camera on a folding tripod, a big square box of polished cherry wood with a brass lens like an eye, and shelves of glass plates racked in grooves, and brown bottles with careful labels, and a little tent of black cloth for a dark room, and a tank and trays, and the whole of it smelled sharp and strange, of ether and something metal. "This is a wet plate camera," she said, and her voice changed when she spoke of it, steadied and warmed, the way mine does when I talk about the river. Prosper taught me the whole of it. You pour the plate with collodion, here, and you make it sensitive in the silver bath in the dark, and you have only minutes, while it's still wet, to carry it to the camera and make the exposure and bring it back and develop it before it dries and dies. It's a hard, quick, exacting business, and there's not one part of it a careless hand can fake. She held up a finished plate to the lamp, a portrait of an old man in a hard collar, and even I could see it was fine work, the lines of his face sharp as life, the light on him soft and true. Prosper used to say the camera can't lie, she said, looking at the old man's face. It only shows what stood in front of it in the light. I didn't understand yet how much those words would come to weigh. That night I told her about Ada, sitting by the stove with the rain still coming down, the good years first, the crossings and the church suppers and the 2 little ones in the churchyard, and then the fever and the Thursday and the Friday. And Nora listened all the way down without saying one of the soft, useless things. And when I'd finished, she said only, "You loved her out loud." And most people don't get loved out loud, and I had to look at the fire a while after that. Then she talked, some, more than she meant to, I think, because the rain and the dark and a kind ear will do that. Prosper Vane had been twice her age, a traveling photographer who'd come through her town in Illinois when she was a girl working a poorhouse laundry, and he'd seen her watching his camera and he'd taught her the trade and, in time, married her. And for 8 years the two of them had gone up and down the river country making portraits and views, and it had been, she said, the only true home she'd ever had. 4 wheels and a canvas roof, and a man who thought her worth teaching. He died of a lung sickness 14 months back in a town called Sabetha, and after she'd buried him, she'd painted his name off the wagon side because she couldn't bear to answer to it from strangers, and she'd been running ever since. A woman alone with a camera, which she said was a thing that made some men bold and some towns unkind, so she kept moving. But why keep moving so hard, I asked her, when a good hand at a trade could settle and do well? And she went still, and the stove ticked, and after a while she said, because of Coy Bracken. I set my cup down. Who's that? I said. A man in Sabetha, she said, where Prosper died, the biggest man in that county. He owned the bank and the freight line and half the main street, and when Prosper took sick and we ran out of money, Bracken loaned us against the wagon and the whole outfit, the camera and all of it, at terms I couldn't read at the time and didn't understand till later. And when Prosper died, owing him, Bracken came to the boarding house where I was nursing my husband's body toward the grave, and he told me the outfit was his now by the paper, and that he'd let me keep it, and my freedom if I'd stay in his county and make portraits under his name for his profit, and she stopped, and be at his convenience, is how he put it. Her jaw was hard, so I took the wagon in the night, and I ran, she said, and I have been running from that county 14 months, because the paper he holds says the whole outfit is his, and a woman alone can't fight a man who owns the courthouse. I sat with that a while. There are things you want to say that are no use said aloud. Why the camera, though? I asked at last. Of all you might have run with, why haul a thing that heavy and that dear across half a state with the man who claims it right behind you? And she was quiet, and then she said something I didn't understand the size of yet. Because Prosper made a plate his last week alive, she said, in Sabetha, of Coy Bracken's new mill, the fine new grist mill Bracken was raising on the creek, that half the county had money in. Bracken hired him to make a proud view of it for the newspaper, the beams going up, the men on the framing. Prosper made the plate, and we developed it in the wagon that night, and he looked at it a long time and went quiet. And he said, Nora, there's something in this picture a man wasn't meant to keep. And he wrapped that one plate separate in wool and put it at the bottom of the plate box under all the others, and 3 days later he was too sick to speak, and then he was gone, and I never knew what he saw in it, and I've been too afraid to look and too afraid to leave it behind. I looked at her stained hands in the lamplight. Have you truly never looked? I said. I don't have the eye Prosper had, she said, and I was afraid that if I looked and understood it, I'd have to do something about it, and doing something means going back to that county. So I've carried it 14 months in the dark of that box and told myself it was only a picture of a mill. We didn't go tearing out to the shed that night to look at it in a lamp. A wet plate view like that, she said, you read properly by daylight, in the sun, held right, and a careless look could tell you less than a careful one. So she'd wait for morning, and I could see that having said it out loud had already cost her enough for one night. But in the morning we brought the wrapped plate out into the clear September light on my porch, and Nora unwound the wool careful as unwrapping a newborn. and she held the glass up to the sun and turned it slow, and I stood at her shoulder and looked too. And at first it was only what she'd said. A fine new mill in a picture. Tall, raw timber framing against the sky. A crew of men standing proud along a beam. A mill pond behind. Then Nora went very still. There, she said, low. Look at the foot of the main sill, where it meets the stone. And I looked. And where the great bottom timber of the whole mill sat down onto its stone foundation, the plate showed, clear as anything in that hard, bright silver light, that the timber didn't meet the stone at all. There was a gap, a hand's width of daylight under the sill, chalked up crooked with wedges and loose rubble and a broken bit of old rail, the whole weight of that mill riding on a bodged-up lie of scrap, where it was meant to sit solid on cut stone. And along the timber itself, where the camera caught it raking in the low sun, you could see the wood was punky and split. Old salvage timber painted over to look new. Not the sound green oak a mill like that wanted. It's built wrong, I said, though I'm no millwright. It's built on nothing. Nora's hand was shaking now that held the plate. Prosper knew, she said. He'd built enough in his life to know. That mill was raised on rotten salvage timber and packed up on rubble to save Bracken the cost of doing it right, and Bracken sold shares in it to half that county on the strength of a proud picture in the paper, a picture Prosper made. Only Prosper made a truer one too, and hid it, because he knew what it would do to us if Bracken learned we'd seen. I looked at that little square of glass throwing the September sun, and I understood for the first time that I was standing on my own porch holding, in a stranger's stained hands, the kind of truth that men will kill to keep buried. We can't fix a mill 3 counties off from this porch, I said, but I know a man who ought to see this. Now, I have a nephew down in Jefferson City, my late brother's boy, name of Emmett Caro, who reads law for a firm there and has more sense than his whole generation put together, and I'd not have known where to begin with a thing like this. But Emmett would. I wrote him that night, careful, and said only that a matter of a fraudulent building and a widow wronged had come up to my landing, and that I needed an honest hour of his counsel, and I put it on the morning mail wagon. And while we waited to hear, the wonder of the thing worked on Nora. She'd carried that plate 14 months as a fear, and now it was out in the light. It turned, day by day, into something else. She got quiet and thoughtful, and then one evening she said, if it's true, and it can be shown true, then Prosper didn't die owing a scrap of anything to Coy Bracken. It's the other way around. Bracken owes every soul in that county who bought a share in a mill that's standing on a lie. And the paper he holds over me, the paper that says the outfit's his, he got that same week he was cheating them all, from a man he already knew was too sick to fight. I don't think an honest court lets a cheat like that keep collecting his debts. She looked at me. But I can't walk into that courthouse alone. You won't, I said, before I'd rightly decided to say it, and once it was out, I found I meant it all the way down. Emmett wrote back inside the week, and then he came, riding up the mill road on a hired horse the next Sunday. A lean, serious young fellow in a dusty coat, and he looked at that plate in the porch light for the better part of an hour, tilting it and holding it, and asking Nora quiet, careful questions about how a wet plate view is made and whether it can be doctored. And Nora explained the whole of the process to him. The wet plate that must be poured and shot and developed inside minutes, the way the collodion sets its own fine grain that can't be forged, the way the silver holds only what light truly fell on it. The camera can't lie, she told my nephew. The way she told me. It only shows what stood in front of it in the light. And this stood in front of it 14 months ago. And the plate is dated in my husband's hand on the edge. See? and it's witnessed by the newspaper's own proud picture from the same day, the same mill, the same hour. Only they printed the flattering angle, and this is the true one. Emmett set the plate down very gently, like it might go off. "Uncle," he said, "this isn't just a widow's quarrel over a wagon. If that mill's what this glass says it is, this is fraud on a whole county, and a court will want to hear it, and the man who's chasing this woman is going to want it in the river a great deal more than he wants his wagon back." He looked at Nora. "Have you a witness besides the plate?" he asked. "Anyone who saw the building of it?" And Nora thought and said, "There were men on that crew who I heard grumble that they were framing on salvage, but they were Bracken's men and afraid. And there was the old millwright he ran off, a man named Tull, who quit rather than sign off on the sills, and Prosper spoke to him once, and I think Tull went north to his daughters at Boonville when Bracken blackballed him." Emmett wrote the name Tull in a little book. "Boonville's a day from here," he said. "That I can look into." We didn't sleep much settling it that night at my kitchen table, the three of us, but by the end there was a shape to it. Emmett would file, in the county at Sabetha, to void the paper Bracken held over Nora's outfit, on the grounds it was got by fraud from a dying man and, bigger by far, he'd carry what the plate showed to the state, because a mill built on rotten salvage with public shares sold against it was a matter no county boss could bury forever, and he'd go by Boonville and find the millwright Tull. It was a great deal to load onto one flat little square of glass and one stained pair of hands, but it was true, and true has a weight of its own. Emmett took careful tracings and measurements and a written statement, but the plate itself Nora would not let leave her keeping, and I didn't blame her, and Emmett agreed it was safest that the original glass, the thing itself, stay hidden and moving and not sit in any one office where a rich man's reach could find it. So it went back into the wool, back into the bottom of the plate box, and the plate box came out of the wagon and into a place in my house only Nora and I knew. But you cannot start a thing like that in a small county without the wind of it carrying, and it carried, all the way back down the river to Sabetha, and it carried a rider up my mill road on a gray morning 8 days later. Nora was on the porch with a pan of feed for the hens, and she saw him come around the willows on the far bank and rein up at the water, and the pan went out of her hands and the feed scattered, and she said one word, "Bracken." And then she was gone into the house without another sound. It wasn't Bracken himself, as it turned out, but a man he sent, which is worse in its way. A heavy, smooth fellow in a good town coat who stood on the far bank and called for the ferry, and I poled the empty barge across to him because a ferryman ferries, and I'd not learn a thing about a man by refusing to look at him. He gave his name as Del Sutter, agent for Mr. Coy Bracken of Sabetha, and he was courteous as a snake in the shade the whole crossing. "Fine landing," he said, looking my new timber over with the eyes of a man pricing what isn't his. "Cost a good deal to rebuild after the flood, I'd wager. 1,200 near enough from the Blue Rock Bank, and due, right about now, I should think." I said nothing and poled. He tried again. "Mister, Bracken's a generous man to his friends," he said. "A note like yours at that bank, why, that could be seen to, quiet and complete, for a man who did Mr. Bracken a small friendly turn. There's a woman gone missing from our county, you understand, a poor, unsettled widow, took a wagon and camera that weren't hers and run off, and Mr. Bracken, being kind, only wants his property back and the poor creature seen to safe. Word is, she came this way. A man who helped hand her home quiet," Sutter said, "and helped hand back a certain box of old glass plates she stole along with the rest, that man would find his troubles at the bank just melt away." I brought the barge into my landing and made it fast before I answered him. "It's a wide river, Miss Sutter," I said, "and a lot of roads come down to it. I've hauled 100 wagons this season and don't recall the freight of any of them. That'll be 5 cents for the crossing, and another 5 to carry you back, and Mr. Bracken can afford it." He looked at me a long moment, and then he smiled without any warmth in it at all, and he took his shoe off my landing timber, and he said, "Curious thing. Sound over water. My man across the river says the folks in your town mention there's fine portrait work being done up on this bluff of late. A real camera hand, they say. Pretty pictures." He touched his hat. "You have a good autumn, ferryman, and mind that note?" And I pulled him back across, and he rode off south, the way a man leaves a thing he already believes is his. I found Nora sitting on the floor of the back room in the dark, with her knees drawn up and both hands pressed over her mouth, and I got down to her level on my old knees and stayed there until she could look at me. "He knows I'm here," she said. "He'll say I'm a thief and mad, and they'll believe him. They always believe him. Then we'll make a court look at the plate," I said, "and let the camera say what your husband couldn't stay alive to say. Prosper hid the truth for you to use, Nora, not to run from. You are not going to face that man alone. You hear me? Not alone." 2 nights after that, my ferry horse set up a racket in the small hours, and my old dog with him, and by the time I got down with the red lantern there was nothing in the yard but cold and a line of smooth-soled boot prints, town boots. No kind of thing a riverman wears, going from the machine shed where the wagon stood to a shed window that had been jimmied and back. They'd been into the wagon. In the morning we saw they'd pulled the plate box out of its rack and gone through it plate by plate in the dark. Dozens of Nora's portraits, strangers' faces, thrown down and some of them cracked underfoot, hunting the one glass that mattered. But it wasn't there. The true plate, the mill plate, had slept those 2 nights not in the wagon at all, but wrapped in wool inside Ada's old flour bin in my kitchen, behind the meal, where no smooth-booted stranger up from Sabetha was going to think to dig. After that night, Nora stopped keeping any of it in the wagon. And she stopped flinching quite so hard, too, I noticed, because a man who sends thieves in the dark is a man who's afraid, and fear in a rich man is a crack you can drive a wedge into. The next evening I found her out on the porch under the lit red lantern, looking down the black slope toward the river. "I keep hauling my trouble up your landing," she said. "Trouble was already on the water," I said. "You just made my bank of it before it did." She almost smiled at that. "When this is over," she said, "whichever way it falls, I won't hang on you like a debt. I can make portraits anywhere there's a town and a face. There's talk of a rail town at Dixon wanting a steady camera." "Stay past the crossing season," I said, and it came out plain with nothing dressed on it, because I'd been carrying it a fortnight and it walked out on its own. This house had a child's room short of full once. It's been a wife short of full 3 years. It's got 2 rooms of quiet in it and a red light nobody comes for. "Stay," she turned and looked at me a long moment under that blood-warm light, and then she put her stained hand over mine on the porch rail and left it there, and neither of us said the rest of it, because the rest was understood, and understood is enough for people our age who've both stood at a grave. Emmett found the millwright Tull at his daughter's in Boonville, and Tull, it turned out, had been carrying his own shame 2 years, same as the ferryman carries his trouble, and the widow carried her plate, and when Emmett showed him the tracing of what the camera caught under that sill, the old man wept and said he'd known. He'd quit rather than put his name to it, and he'd have spoken up if he'd thought a living soul would believe one blackballed millwright over Coy Bracken. But a A picture made the same week by an honest man now in his grave, that a court would believe, and yes, he'd swear to every board of it. And the state, when Emmett laid it before them, moved faster than any county boss could stop, because a public mill, with shares sold across a whole county, built on rot and rubble, was exactly the sort of thing that gets an inspector on the next train, whether the local big man likes it or not. They found the mill just as the plate said. They found the rotten sills and the rubble chocks and the salvaged timber painted new. And they found the honest deposit money Bracken had taken from small farmers and shopkeepers for shares. And they found the pattern of it. Other buildings, other papers, other folks in that county squeezed the same way when they came to him, broke and grieving. The hearing on Nora's wagon and the far larger reckoning on the mill came on together, on a cold, clear Wednesday in the last week of October, 3 days before my note at the Blue Rock Bank fell due, in the county courthouse down at Sabetha, and Emmett had me and Nora on the early train, the plate riding in a padded case in Nora's own lap the whole way, her hands never once leaving it. The room was full. Farmers and their wives who'd put share money into that mill, shopkeepers, the old millwright Tull in his one good coat, his daughter beside him, and Coy Bracken himself in the front, a big florid man in a coat that cost more than my ferry earned in a year, with a smooth city lawyer beside him who talked with his hands turned up like he was handing the court a gift. He called Nora a thief and a mad wandering woman who'd stolen a dead man's outfit and spun a wild tale to cover it. He said the paper Bracken held was plain and honest and signed. And then Emmett stood up, and my nephew's dusty coat plainness fell off him the moment he got angry. And he was very angry, quiet and cold and certain. He laid out the paper Bracken held over Nora and showed the court it was got the same week Bracken was selling shares in a building he knew to be false, from a man Bracken knew to be dying, and he called it what it was. And then he did the thing we'd carried across a state to do. He asked Nora Vane to come forward and show the court her late husband's last photograph. Nora stood, and she was steady, steadier than I could have been, and she opened the padded case and took out that little square of glass, and Emmett had arranged a frame in the courthouse window, where the hard, clear October sun came through, and Nora fitted the plate into it, and the light came through the silver and threw the picture up sharp for the whole room, the proud new mill, and there, plain as a wound, the gap under the main sill, the rubble chocks, the broken rail, the whole great weight of it riding on a lie. A wet plate view, Nora told the court, in that steadied, warm voice she used for her trade, made by my husband Prosper Vane on the 14th of August last, dated on the edge in his own hand, of Mr. Bracken's mill, the same day, the same hour. The newspaper's own proud picture was made from the flattering side. The camera cannot lie, she said. It shows only what stood in the light. This stood in the light. And the old millwright Tull stood up in his place without being asked, an old man shaking in his one good coat, and he said, I framed that mill, and I quit that mill, and every board that picture shows is true, and I'll swear it before this court and before God. You could have heard the river through the walls. It went so quiet. Bracken leaned to his city lawyer and said something low and hard, and the lawyer had nothing to say back to him. The judge was a spare gray man brought in from out of the county, because half the local bench had shares in that mill, and he looked at the picture in the window a long time, and then he took his spectacles off and folded them. The paper the widow signed is void, he said, void when it was made, got by fraud from a dying man by a man who was at that same hour defrauding this entire county. The outfit is restored to Nora Vane, free and clear. And this, he said. And he did not look at the wagon anymore. He looked at Bracken. This photograph and this witness are enough to open a matter far past this widow's wagon, and the clerk will carry this file to the state's attorney before the sun sets tonight. We are adjourned. Coy Bracken walked out of that courtroom past benches full of the very people he'd cheated, farmers and shopkeepers whose share money had gone into rotten wood, and not one of them nodded to him, and not one gave him the mercy of looking away. And I've thought since that that walk down the aisle cost him more than any money the state would come to take. On the courthouse steps, a man came up to Nora, a thick-necked fellow who'd been one of Bracken's framing crew, and he turned his hat in his hands and said, "I was on that crew, ma'am, and I knew, and I was afraid. And your husband was the only honest man on that job site, and I'm sorry I stayed quiet over him." "Come tell it to the statesman, then," Nora said, not unkindly, "and say it as loud as you kept it quiet." Bracken's reckoning went on long past us. The state in his books and his mill condemned, and his shares to be made good out of whatever they could take from him. And other widows and other cheated men coming forward once they saw one had lived to do it, but that was the county's business and not mine. What was mine happened 3 days later, before a dollar of anything was settled. On the very morning my note fell due, Nora rode the ferry with me across to the Blue Rock Bank, and she laid down cash money on my $1,200 note, the fee the court had made Bracken pay her for 14 months of a stolen livelihood, paid it entire, and my landing was free. I argued it exactly once. She put one stained finger flat on the banker's counter and said, "Call it keep," for a crossing on a cold night and a room with a bolt and a red light left burning. And I let it be, because I'd learned by then that taking a proud person's gift is its own kind of giving. As for the mill plate, the true one, Nora made prints of it for the state, and for the newspaper that had run the flattering lie. And that paper printed the true picture on its front page with the widow's name under it. Nora Vane, Portraits and Views. And folks came from 3 counties to have their likenesses made by the woman whose husband's last photograph had brought down Coy Bracken. And she never wanted for work again. But she didn't take the Railtown trade at Dixon. She backed her wagon into my machine shed for the last time that November, and over that winter the two of us built a proper portrait gallery onto the south side of my plank house, with a wall of good north window light the way she said a camera wants, and a little dark room off the back with a proper sink, and Emmett had a sign carved for over the door that said Vane and Caro, Portraits and Views, Ash Ferry Landing. The child's room that was never a child's became the place she poured her plates. And come spring, in the little Blue Rock church where I'd buried Ada and my 2 babies, Nora Vane and I were married, an old ferryman and a traveling widow, with Emmett standing up for me and the old millwright Tull come down from Boonville to stand up for her. And there wasn't much of a crowd, but the ones who came were the ones who'd learned by then what she was worth. She made no portrait of the wedding, said some things you keep in your own eyes and not on glass, but the first plate she poured in the new gallery was of the 2 of us on the porch under the red lantern, and it hangs there now where the morning light finds it. An old man who runs a ferry, and a woman with silver-stained hands, and you can see in it, if you look close, that neither of us is quite believing our luck. My note hangs by the kitchen door now, in a dime store frame, stamped paid in red. And my Ada was right about that lantern. And that is the whole of it, and the end of it. You don't light it for the folks already inside where it's warm and the way is known. You light it for whoever the dark is still chasing, and you light it every single night, not because you know who's coming down the mill road, but because you don't. One cold September evening, the dark chased everything I've come to love down that road and onto my ferry. A broken wagon and a tired horse, and a woman with a painted-out name and a photograph she was too afraid to look at, and I pulled her across a high river in the last of the light, and never once dreamed I was ferrying my own second life over the water. It's raining tonight, soft, no wind in it. The red lanterns lit on the corner post. The river's going by the way it always has and always will. And from the south gallery, over the low tick of the stove, there's the small chemical smell of collodion and silver, and the clink of glass in a tray, and somebody humming low and easy. Not making portraits for anybody's supper now, not running from anybody's paper, just making them true, just for home.